Satoshi checkmated the whole world with a few lines of code. Because that's really what Satoshi Nakamoto did. Satoshi knew that in order to be able to be successful, a lot of people had to get super wealthy. It's a bit like feeling of hunger. As humans, we kind of need that drive to adapt and to change our incentives. And Satoshi knew that really well, that if he would have just gone out there with books preached to people to say you have to have low time preference and no time, high time preference, and you need to stop this dopamine culture and you need to go into more long-term thinking and building and thinking of your children and your children's children, everybody would have said like, okay, you're building some new religion. Like, that's what Christianity, Judaism, and Islam teaching people already. And they've been around for a few thousand years. So I don't need a new guy telling me something new about that. Whereas with the ability to have the salability over time, as Saifuddin explained so well in the Bitcoin standard, and the salability over space and the absolute limit and the halving that comes with it, you've basically built perfect money.
Hello and welcome to Bitcoin for Professionals with me, Haris Irfan. This week we've got Muhammed Yesilhark with us. He is the Chief Investment Officer of Noia Capital based in Dubai. He is an investor, an entrepreneur and a philanthropist. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Muhammed.
Hi, salam, Haris. Pleasure meeting you again, seeing you again, and it's an honor to be here.
Likewise, and wa alaikum assalam. You have a pretty varied CV. I think I summarized it fairly accurately when I said investor, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, very happy to do so. So, born and raised in Germany, as you can see from the color of my hair, fifth generation German. Jokes aside, I was born and raised in Stuttgart in the south of Germany. Originally Turkish parents, but grew up in Germany. Never really lived in Turkey except for a short period during high school, and lived basically half my life in Germany and half my life in the UK. Started I did a double degree in economics with a focus on finance, and then started in investment banking with firms like UBS, Deutsche, and then mainly at Lazard. And then relatively early left the banking M&A corporate finance world and joined the European hedge fund world, basically with York Capital first, and then various other hedge funds. I followed up by SAC, which is now Point72. I was a partner and portfolio manager there. And then also head of European equities at Carmignac, which I did until 2016. And then when I left that role, I basically was at the cusp of what's called the non-dom res cutoff for non-UK British born individuals that are living in the UK. And then I moved over to Dubai basically in 2017 and been in Dubai since. Best decision of my life, here with myself, wife, and 2 kids.
Fantastic. So you're obviously Noia Capital is very much related to digital assets, and you're by some measures a fairly early Bitcoiner, I think. How did you first hear of Bitcoin, and what led you down the rabbit hole?
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. So during my time at York Capital, we had this amazing idea in 2008 when the oil price was at $140 to actually open up a Moscow office, which we ended up closing 2 years after, basically. But given I was responsible for EMEA, I hired initially the Moscow team, so to say. That person that we had found there, ex-Wharton graduate, extremely capable individual, he found me years later again when I was at Carmignac. I mean, we've kept in touch, but he found me again and he said, look, I have to come with my co-founders to the office. I want to show you something. I've left the hedge fund and then the private equity industry, which he had gone into. And I'm now the vice chairman of a Bitcoin miner in Eastern Europe. And I was like, I mean, I don't know what this guy is talking about. He knows we'd only do public names at Carmignac. We wouldn't do any private investments. I think it was a bit of a combo of, curiosity and wanting to catch up with an old friend, basically. And I took the meeting and,
What year?
2015, 2015. Yeah. Summer 2015. It was supposed to be a 30-minute meeting. My assistant, I actually came in with my analyst. My analyst walked out, who's now a portfolio manager, walked out half an hour later saying he doesn't understand anything. And it was an excuse of having received the call, never came back to the meeting. I left 45, 50 minutes after to just change my block because my pages were finished. And I walked out and I told my assistant, you can cancel all my other meetings, replaced with a new block of paper. And I basically went back into the meeting. I even remember asking my analyst, how did you leave such an interesting meeting? And he said, I didn't understand anything. Eastern European guys doing something with data centers, not interesting for me. And basically, he didn't show any interest whatsoever. But for me, it was like, this is so um, earth shattering. Like for me, it was a massive moment. And from then onwards, you will remember as well, I'm sure, back in the days, it was so difficult to find information really on Bitcoin, etc. I was literally watching 17, 16-year-olds having done some YouTube videos trying to explain to me what proof of work is and how decentralization is supposed to work, etc. So really went down the rabbit hole there. But for me, the aha moment was, I'll be very honest with you, Harris. In the beginning, I just bought a bit of Bitcoin around the three, $400, $500 level. It was 353, if I remember exactly. I remember the number obviously, but that was really for me to just, the chart had gone down from from the 1,000+ level down to 250, and it was just recovering. And me being a value investor, and we were always a combination of fundamentally looking at businesses, but then also trying to get the momentum right. I was like, obviously there is not much fundamental back in the days that I had understood with regards to Bitcoin, but I saw that the chart was looking good, and at the time I was like, okay, this is interesting from what these guys had told me, so I just bought a bit, basically, right? But
Yeah.
the real getting into it was when I then tested it. I tested it on a Sunday, and I sent money around the globe to friends that included Japan, Iran, Germany, and London. And we were basically able to turn the money around once around the globe on a Sunday. And that was for me the aha moment. I was like, everything is closed, all banks are closed, all businesses are closed, and I can
Fantastic.
move, any amount of money around the globe. That's when I then really got interested into in the technology, basically.
I'm fascinated by something that happened in that meeting that you had with this gentleman who used to work in the Moscow team. Something that maybe it's because you're naturally intellectually curious and the analyst that you were with who left the meeting, maybe by nature he wasn't. I don't know. What do you think it was that didn't hook him but did hook you?
I think it's very difficult to say. I mean, he's an extremely successful portfolio manager now. I think he has intellectual curiosity, definitely. I would argue that he's maybe a bit less open to new things. He's not someone that is always at the edge of technology, I would say. Whereas I've always been, wired that way. As a portfolio manager, I was always trying to understand what is it in my portfolio that could get disrupted by new technology that is emerging out there. Um, but I think in from an Islamic point of view, I mean, my name is Muhammad, and I at least try to be a religious guy. And we always say, nasib, right? I mean, you do whatever you want to do, but you receive what you meant to receive, basically, right? And I guess I was meant to understand it more for like looking back now in hindsight. I was meant to understand it at that time, and maybe he was meant to understand it at another time. One always says that you buy Bitcoin at the price you deserve, right? So it's just different for everybody. I can't pinpoint it now, I would say.
So tell us a little bit more about Noia Capital and digital assets. What's your professional involvement in Bitcoin?
Yeah, so what then happened is I moved to Dubai, and initially I actually started Q2Q Capital. Q2Q Capital stands for Qalb to Qalb in Arabic, which means in English heart to heart. And it was basically the idea of creating an asset management company that is focused on tail risk hedging. What that means for people that are not from the industry is basically a fund that quasi almost doesn't make any money for when markets are normal, but then makes an utter killing when things blow up, basically, right? That's the tail risk that you're hedging, so to say. And the reason why we wanted to do that was because we basically found an idea of selling Bitcoin volatility and buying equity volatility. And the differential was 10x. You were selling 120, 130, 150 vol, and you were buying 12, 13, 15 vol, right? Which meant that you were actually making 6, 7, 8% a year if nothing happens. But at the same time, if then something actually happens and volatility in the equity markets goes through the roof, which generally happens with sharp downturns because market always goes up in steps and down in elevators, right? As people say. So in that context, it would have actually, the idea was a very, very good one. Unfortunately, in 2018, the United Arab Emirates generally and the regulators, the financial regulators in the DIFC and in ADGM were not there yet. We were too early for an idea that included something in digital assets, basically. So unfortunately, it didn't work. So I had to wind it down, basically, in late 2018. And obviously, back in the days in late 2018 as well, the digital assets had a strong downturn. We had started in mining. So in 2016, I started Bitcoin mining, and I actually then sold my Bitcoin mining operation to Hut 8, which is now listed in the US and in Canada, and which I'm sure many people know that are following the ecosystem. And so when that didn't work in 2019, somebody that I really rate really highly, and shout out to him, Jawad Mian from Stray Reflections, who writes macro research for a lot of very high profile hedge fund managers. He's now moved to Canada. He introduced me to a Belgian duo that was interested to start a digital asset fund. And I basically co-founded Noia with them. Jerome and Nico, they're both my co-founders, but Jerome is now my managing partner. And I joined Noia as a senior advisor, really to just, given my experience in portfolio management, I was joining their investment committee meetings once a month, etc., like a senior advisor would do. And that morphed into, the real problem happened when they added me to the Slack in 2020, late 2020, early 2021. And I got involved. I'm like quite hands-on, etc. And Jerome, there were three of them at the time. They then came to me and they said, look, every time we agree, the market does the opposite. So can we please see if we can find a structure here where you would join us full time? And that's when we then sat down and transformed Noia from a pure digital asset fund into a multi-family office for now 4 verticals that includes digital assets as a bedrock. We have one of the oldest running digital asset funds in Europe with 6 years now under the belt. So I joined as a CIO in late 2021, early 2022, basically, and been running it since. In the meantime, we acquired the DIFC company. We moved our headquarters from Brussels to Dubai. We still have the funds in Luxembourg. We have 2 more funds now that are outside of digital assets. So it's become a proper multi-family office operation with more than 140 family offices and ultra high net worth individuals that have joined us. And we operate under those 4 verticals that we believe are natural hedges to each other, basically.
You seem to spend a lot of your time going around the world, orange pilling corporations and governments. Something you and I discussed a little while back, and I found very interesting. First of all, I think it's fair to say that Turks and Pakistanis are like brothers, and of course your heritage is Turkish, my heritage is Pakistani, even though we're actually Europeans. And I tell people my head is British, but my heart is Pakistani. Something you told me very interesting. You visited Pakistan very recently, and I thought that was a very interesting story. Tell us about what happened there and what you were trying to do.
Yeah, so I did visit Lahore very recently, and it was my first time actually in Pakistan. I had never been to Pakistan, and quite funnily, as a funny story related to that, Harris, I was invited to an Indian wedding just until the day before I flew to Pakistan. So I was in India for 3 days at that wedding, and then came back to Dubai, stayed less than 24 hours, and then flew out to Pakistan. All my Indian friends were telling me they're never going to let you in. And they did let me in. I guess it must be the German passport, and nobody asked me any questions, basically. I was basically invited to Lums University in Lahore, which is considered like the Harvard of Pakistan, let's say.
It's very well
And
known. It's very highly thought of. Yeah.
yeah, very well-known institution. You could see, and it's well protected as well. I know, and there the crowd was a very, very high quality crowd, government officials, all the way to the dean of the university, very, the head of the economics department, and multiple other people, basically. And it was alongside the new launch of a digital asset research center, which was funded by Stacks, the Bitcoin L2, basically. Munib Ali is a LUMS graduate, and he lives in New York. I mean, he's the founder of Stacks, for the ones that don't know, and he basically granted the university, LUMS University, this digital asset research center. And as the part of that launch, they invited various experts, basically from the field, and we basically had a fireside chat there. And then I had the chance to get involved with some of the other members from the government, basically, that are involved in the whole digital asset push of Pakistan itself.
What happened in those conversations with the government officials?
So, uh, first of all, everything that Pakistan is doing in that context now seems extremely positive. It was very, very encouraging. The government seems to be doing all the right steps. I was in a closed door meeting with the state energy company that was basically looking at ways of starting significant Bitcoin mining operations in the country. And I was very impressed by the knowledge of the people, by their understanding and their openness to actually, elaborate on this overall, right? I mean, generally, when you act with government entities outside of the UAE, which is a whole new, a whole different dimension of expertise generally. But I've dealt with governments before, and that was quite surprising and refreshing of how good the knowledge and the understanding was, basically, of the level of the people. But the conversations were really, I'm a very open and frank guy, and I don't mince my words, basically. So when I had the chance, I told them everything that I thought they should be doing and how I think they should be doing it. And I think it was received extremely well. The fact that I believe that exactly what the United States announced, that you need to make a differentiation between a digital asset stockpile, which you might get because you get a hold of some hacks or some judicial processes, and therefore the government receives some various coins and digital assets. But that's a different approach to that type of stack versus actually a Bitcoin strategic reserve, right? And I think now, over the last few days, the announcements that came out from the government of Pakistan actually show that all of that, what we discussed, is being implemented, and it looks extremely encouraging, actually.
What techniques do you use? How do you convince others to adopt BTC as a reserve asset, as a treasury management tool, even as a form of money? I mean, what do you say to them?
I find it extremely easy now, Harris, especially now since 2025 and since Trump came into power again. I find the pitch much easier now. The reason being is um, I don't focus on the technological revolution of blockchain technology. I focus on the monetary revolution of what Bitcoin brings to the world, basically. In the old days, you were like, yeah, but the world needs a neutral reserve currency. Don't you understand? The United States government and the US dollar can't be the only reserve currency for the next 100, 200 years. People were very, it was difficult for people to understand that, basically. Whereas now, given what happened with the trade war, basically, that we had now in the last few weeks, the pitch has become super simple. You could see very clearly now, of all the work that we know from Ray Dalio and others, that you're going from a mono power situation to a multipolar world where two real powers are clashing each other, right? You have the US with its massive GDP and consumer power, but you have China on the other hand as well, right? And then it becomes much easier, given that everyone that's outside of China, general natural attitude is to say, oh yeah, I can't think of myself, especially in the Western world, to hold yuan as a reserve currency and to hold all my assets and value them in yuan. So it kind of immediately, it's easy for them to understand that there needs to be a neutral asset. And then you just have to convince them that it can't be gold. And there, my pitch is extremely easy. I say, look, gold worked perfectly because it travels extremely well over time because of the law of entropy. You can dig it in your garden, you can leave it in your cupboard, you can try to eat it, you can do whatever you want. It doesn't degrade, basically, right? It stays in its form, but it doesn't travel well over space.
Yeah.
And we've seen this with the Ukrainian war. We've seen this with the war in Lebanon. We've seen this with the war in Syria. Anywhere and everywhere where people had to move with their wealth and start a new life in like quick time periods, you can't do that. If you have a bit of jewelry, you can walk around with it. But if you have to move 10, 2, 5, 10 bars or whatever your wealth amounts to, it gets extremely difficult, basically, right? So Bitcoin is the only asset that travels extremely well over time as well as over space, basically, right? And then I think the pitch is done, basically. I don't know if I could convince you now, but as an OG Bitcoiner.
Well, I mean, you mentioned your faith earlier as a Muslim, and we've said many times on the show before that the low time preference that Bitcoin inculcates in people is very much in keeping with the ethics and the time preference of Muslims and people of faith generally. So that's something I find fascinating. But one of the counter arguments I often hear is, yeah, but Bitcoin's not backed by anything. It's not commodity backed. It's not real. It's not corporeal. And Islam says that, these are the currencies, and they mention gold and silver. They're real. You hold them in your hand, you put them in your pocket. What do you say to that?
I think it's extremely easy because now people, especially again, that pitch as well, I agree with you, from 2015 to 2023, 24 was quite difficult to make people understand. Now, even that pitch has become super simple. And the reason why that's in my mind has become super simple is because now everybody understands that you need these massive data center clusters to run all of these AI models, basically, right? Everyone knows there is AI training and AI inference. Everyone knows that there is billions and billions of dollars going into this ecosystem. So people now can understand that, proof of work can have value. All the exahashes that are backing basically the Bitcoin network, people now understand that there is some sort of physicality behind it, right? It's like arguing, oh, I can't touch electricity, I can't see electricity, so it might not, why is that valuable, or why would it, like, where does it come from, kind of thing, right? I mean, either you get electrocuted, then you know what it is, or you see all these power generation plants, and then you understand that clearly there is something happening that produces electricity, right? So it's kind of the same now with AI and all the data centers that have happened. I think even that one is extremely easy now to grasp for people.
Yeah. So just before you started talking about gold, you touched on Trump. And I know macroeconomics and geopolitics is a pet subject of yours. You enjoy discussing it, exploring it. What do you think is going to happen next? Where are we going to go from here in terms of Trump tariffs?
Oh, very difficult to predict, obviously, what's going to happen. I think the way the US government is negotiating is extremely counterproductive, I would say, right? We had an ex-foreign minister of Turkey, which didn't stay very long, which is kind of normal in Turkey. But he had this saying. He was saying that Turkey only has friends and potential friends,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in my mind, that's really the approach that as the reserve currency holder that exports first and foremost your dollars and banks all the seigniorage basically as the government of that's printing those dollars, you need to have that approach with friends and potential friends. And I think this government currently has more of the approach of the exceptionalism and why am I doing you a favor and what are you doing as a return, etc. Now you can have that attitude behind the lines or behind the scenes basically, but I think starting with that as a negotiation is just given your fickle situation and given your voter base and given that you still have your own hurdles within Congress and Senate, etc., that you need to pass. I just find that extremely makes it just complicates things unnecessarily. And I think you can do that in a much smarter way, basically, by still achieving what you want, but while smiling, while basically being amenable and being firm, but at the same time being very kind, basically, right? And I think that's why that negotiation that you have ongoing right now, that increases the uncertainty in the world. Now, one can see it's been very bullish for the assets that are there that are the antithesis of that, basically, right? Whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's gold, those are the best performing assets year to date. And since the election, since 5th of November. So that's a very clear differentiation to all other risk assets out there. Um, but I think, the only thing I'm certain of, honestly speaking, Harris, is that it's going to stay volatile, right? Can I rule out that assets are not going to do all-time highs again? I wouldn't rule that out at all, because if we have some sort of bond market vigilante environment, which seems like to be happening again, at least there's a bit of a test of it with the 10-year above the 5 mark. You know, I could easily see the central bank trying to come around and do either secret yield curve control or actually explicit yield curve control. And if they do that, all assets are going to benefit from that, because the market has now understood to read when the printer machine goes on, basically, right? And in that case, the only thing that really goes down is the real value of your dollars, basically, right? So real assets reprice. Then it's just, again, the same question: which one is the fastest horse? And you need to find out the fastest horse. And beyond that, we believe it's Bitcoin, and it's historically been Bitcoin. And and therefore, in that environment, the only thing I can say with what's happening right now is that it's going to stay volatile. But I could see it going up, as well as I could see that the Federal Reserve, for whatever reason, maybe for political reasons, maybe for thinking really that they can't do anything when the bond market is actually, because maybe they could just go out and say, look, the bond market is not listening, so we actually go and have to raise rates like Volcker did in the 1980s, right? Right now, the market is completely disregarding this, basically, right? But that's another scenario, in which case I think that's a very different scenario for risk assets, basically, right? In which case I could see 30-40% downside for risk assets. And then it'll be very interesting to see how gold, how Bitcoin, and other, more, monetary revolution type assets will actually behave, basically, right? That's really how I'm, as much as I can say, basically, on that.
It's really fascinating. There was an article in the Financial Times a few days ago written by Martin Wolf, who I think is their chief economic writer. And, he set out scenarios for what might happen next in terms of reserve assets. And he talked about the euro, he talked about yuan, he mentioned gold. But when it came to digital assets, by which you and I mean Bitcoin, but other people will mean other things, he said it was inconceivable, and he just dismissed it casually. He didn't even discuss it at any degree. He said, inconceivable. This is not one of the scenarios I'm contemplating. How do you feel about that?
Everybody buys and understands Bitcoin at the price they deserve. I think mankind has invented perfect money. A good friend of mine recently said to me, who's known of digital assets and Bitcoin since 2015, but recently really went down the rabbit hole and really understood it really well now, and at least I believe really well now. He said, how is it possible that Satoshi checkmated the whole world with a few lines of code? Because that's really what Satoshi Nakamoto did, basically. Satoshi knew that in order to be able to be successful, a lot of people had to get super wealthy, because otherwise it's a bit like, why do we have the desire, the sexual desire as human beings? If we didn't have the sexual desire, mankind wouldn't probably go on, basically, right? The same with feeling of hunger, the same for, all the other things that you have. As humans, we kind of need that drive, basically, to adapt and to change our incentives, etc. Right? And Satoshi knew that really well. That if he would have just gone out there and with books and books and books preached to people to say you have to have low time preference and no time high time preference, and you need to stop this dopamine culture, and you need to go into more long term thinking and building and thinking of your children and your children's children's, etc. Everybody would have said, like, okay, you're building some new religion, like, that's what Christianity, Judaism, and Islam is teaching people already, and they've been around for a few thousand years, so I don't need a new guy telling me something new about that, basically, right? Whereas, in my mind, with the ability to have the saleability over time, as Saifeddin explained so well in the Bitcoin standard, and the saleability over space, and the absolute limit and the halving that comes with it, etc. you've basically built perfect money, right? And you've built it in a way that just forces people to adopt until the full adoption happens. And then, by the way, Harris, one thing that people don't understand, I think, even within the Bitcoin community, is once we have hyper Bitcoinization, Bitcoin will become the most boring asset on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it will be like, what, brother Harris? Are you still like holding BTC for 2% a year? Like, are you crazy? Open up a restaurant. Go do a new fintech. Start, I don't know, some other business basically where you can make 20% return on capital employed.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen basically, right?
Yeah.
But we're not there yet because, again, as Saifuddin says really well, every business idea is commensurate to what the win is. And the win on Bitcoin is the elimination of all central banks on the planet.
Yeah.
And therefore, the outcome has to be in the trillions, right? And once we're there, then we can talk about everything else. But I think for someone like Martin, he's just not there yet. He didn't jump into it. And, Jamie Dimon was the same up until a few weeks ago. I think once he realized that Larry had changed his view, he was like, okay, wait a minute, Larry Fink now seems to know more than me. Maybe I should ask my daughter to understand a bit more about this. And he seems to have at least, accepted the fact now that he's potentially not going to get disrupted before he retires, basically. And therefore he can try and make some money off it as well, which is what the announcement was last week, that JP Morgan is now allowing some of their customers to buy BTC as well, right? But I think it's just a process, for everybody.
Yeah, very well put. I like that explanation. So I think we're coming pretty close to the end of this pod, and I just wanted to close with getting a couple of thoughts from you. What do you advise young professionals who are looking at Bitcoin, maybe a career in Bitcoin, and what's one insight you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, so I had the daughter of a friend in my office actually this week, who studied in the UK, is 24 years old, resigned, came to Dubai, back to Dubai. She was, she grew up here, although she was born in in London, and she basically just resigned because she didn't like her job, and now she wants to do something in digital assets.
Mhm.
So, and then she came to me because her father said that, I'm probably the right guy to speak to basically on that, from whom he knows. So I ended up chatting with her in my office. And my recommendation to her was, start at first principles. Don't get involved by going to conferences, going to events, going to this, that, the other, and then basically just get captured by this boot camp and that hackathon and that event and this meetup, etc. Actually try to understand every business by where did it start, who started it, what was its motivation, and why was it started, and how did that evolve, basically, right? It gives you so much information about every business and every idea that you should look at. Clearly, the idea of decentralization and the idea of what we are having now with this perfect money that we have right now didn't exist pre the last financial crisis. So the first thing you need to understand is, read first the white paper. We really need start from the first principle. Why did this person or people come up with a white paper at the end of October 2008, 31st of October 2008? And why did they 2.5 months later, 2 months later, launch the first Genesis block on the 3rd of January 2009? Read that first, and then read literature that explains the technological revolution, that explains the monetary revolution, like the Bitcoin standard, like broken money, like that's where you have to start, because you first have to understand the first principles of something before you actually then understand what part of that motivates you, where your skill comes in, what is it that you like to spend your time on, and then you can find your way in that basically ecosystem. And I know how it works. Back then, once you have that, automatically you will start meeting people that are like-minded, that have similar skill sets, and then you will basically get interested in the right direction of this vast now ecosystem that has emerged. We're talking about a 3-4 trillion asset class already, right? I mean, it's super tiny in the global asset class universe, but if you look at company-wise, it's already the 5th largest company on the planet, if you would think of it that way, basically, right? But it's made up of tiny nodes, meaning holders, right? So there is a lot to learn and a lot to embrace, basically. But the biggest thing that I can say to everybody is, don't get caught by the waves and get thrown on one side to this L1 and then to this event and then to that hackathon. really look at first principles, really go back to understand what was the idea, why did this emerge, what does really decentralization mean, why is this so important, and really go back to the first principles, understand it first. And that goes whether you like it or not. It goes by going through literature. You need to sit down, switch off your phone, and basically read the two, three main books that are out there on this subject, and then and we can put them onto the on the bottom of this video. But I think that's the most important in my mind, as a recommendation.
Absolutely, that's excellent advice, and I'm going to steal some of that and pretend that I made it up in the first place. Muhammad, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I really value the time spent with you, and I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Harris. I appreciate being on this podcast, and I wish you all the best, and I hope that I see you soon.
See you soon. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. All the best. Bye bye.